Voilà, je crois qu'on va commencer.
We are going to get started here. So this is a debate about reconciling economics with politics. So I'm just going to start the debate and introduce my panel members. I'm delighted to welcome here Valerie PECRESSE, McINNES, Antoine FRÉROT, and Edouard PHILIPPE. So I'm just going to say a few words of introduction, and then I will hand the floor over to our panelists. So one of the questions that we're going to address during our debate is how do we draw up reforms that economists think will be efficacious, but which will be politically doable and acceptable. One approach to reform is what you might call the Pigouvienne approach, where you try to maximize productive efficiency, so you have the biggest cake impossible, and then you can share that cake out. We can separate production from distribution in that system. And if we take a look at the first reforms of the previous presidential 5-year mandate, tax work, with the flat tax in particular, and the reform of the labour law and the Pellico law and professional training, one can say that that was more or less the approach. These reforms were very efficient. We created 1,200,000 jobs during the previous 5-year mandate. And there have been new businesses, more businesses created than ever in the past, and the purchasing power went up until the Ukraine war hit in, of course. And so then I believe that at every level of revenue, French citizens saw their purchasing power go up during the previous 5-year governmental mandate. So that's the good news about reforms. It's very efficient. The cake was bigger, so there was enough for everybody. And then we had the yellow vest demonstrations. And then the scheduled increase in the cost of petrol and other things really set Paris or set France alight, and they were no longer concerned about climate change, whereby, although climate taxes will enhance the situation because the polluters who pay, and the carbon tax, we know, is a key instrument in the energy transition and in the combat against global warming. It pushes businesses to be greener and to innovate in a green way. So the carbon tax has to be done. We cannot get around it. It's one of the key tools in combating climate change. So this was a reform which all of the countries have carried out, that right-wing and left-wing governments in the past have been pushing. Over 80% of the French population are behind it, but it didn't work. And the question is, why did it not work? So a recent study carried out by Stéphanie Stoncheva, who is a Harvard professor and who also works at the bank, and she carried out a study with the OECD, and this survey carried out an opinion poll on how climate change policy is perceived. It covered 80 countries, about 60% of the population were covered. And what does this poll show? It shows that supporting environmental strategies requires two things. The policy has to be perceived as being efficient, but on top of that, it has to be perceived as being fair. And that's the problem with the carbon tax. We all thought it was going to be fair and efficient, or most of us did anyway, whereas in fact the program increase in petrol costs was a bit of a regression. In fact, in terms of percentage of your revenue, it was impacting more the poorer families, and it really did strike those families who lived out of city centres and who did not have any other means of transport than a car. In France, we have fast trains. You can go from one major city to another, but to get in from a banlieue into a city centre, then it's just not as good at all. It could be much better, let's put it that way. But that's not the... Let me not digress. So in Germany, it's the opposite. They don't have very good train services between major cities, but they have excellent services from the outskirts into the town centre. So in France, we were struck by that. The richer people were seeming to get away from that because often they live in the city centre, and if you increase fuel costs for them, they're always going to be able to buy that more expensive fuel. And then there was a feeling of injustice, which explains why the reform did not work. There's another reform which seemed to be fair and equitable, and that was the pensions based on a points scoring system. And this point-based system seemed to be a good retirement regime. There were no special regimes. It was the same for everybody. Same thing for everybody. And so it would fluidify the labour market. And then I found myself one day in a debate where I was with someone else who was defending the reform, and there were some teachers who were saying, but we're losing out a lot. We have small salaries, small bonuses. We make up for those small quantities with our pensions. And so they did all the calculations, and we realized that what seemed to be simple was in fact rather complicated, and what was fair, what seemed to be fair, absolutely was not fair. So the political economics of reform is a thrilling subject, and there are always the same questions which are begged. I'm going to list these questions, and I'm going to hand out the microphone to my colleagues. The first question, which is risen, says, when do you need to act quickly? When do you have to do a big bang? And where do you have to go in gradually? So in many of the reforms, we've had to go very, very quickly. We've had to use that state of grace, and there are other areas where you can go more gradually. One example of a gradual success was vaccination. At the very beginning, we said the most vulnerable can, if they want, get a vaccine. And those vulnerable people got vaccinated. So we learned a bit more about the vaccine. So it made the virus less contagious. And then everyone else could vaccinate. It was a very gradual approach. And once the majority of the French population had been vaccinated, and then we did our vaccine pass, because there was political support for that pass. And it was a wonderful measure which the President of France decided to bring in on the 20th of July last year. And I've carried out some surveys on the health front and the economic front, and it shows how very virtuous that pass was. So this is an example of a gradual approach. A gradual approach enables you to build up constituencies in favor of the reform and then to get the reform improved. But there are other situations where that's just not possible. So when do you need to go gradually, and when do you need to go quickly? Second question, so how far do you have to go to compensating the losers? A few years ago, with the Atelier report, there was a book that was written which said that you have to compensate the losers when you're reforming how the taxi industry works. It's not changing the cost of the transition, because we're not compensating those losers. So how do you compensate them, and how do you sort this all out alongside the speed of reforms? And now, the third question, can politicians do without civil society and service sectors? A politician may be tempted to say, I've got to go fast, can't listen to anybody else, but when should that politician say, I'm going to have to take the time to negotiate, no matter how long it takes? There are times when you have to waste time to save time. There are some times you can say, in Germany, they spend a lot of time negotiating, in Sweden as well, so you have to decide when it's best to just forge ahead or when you need to take the time to negotiate. So there's a question about time there. Following question. Are you fed up with all my questions already? Have I already used my 10 minutes? And I've got to start the debate? Is that what you're saying? Sorry, I'm almost finished. Okay, my final question. I'm forging ahead. How can we shift from a system whereby the state is totally powerful and ignores the rest of the population? And how can you change that situation? In Scandinavia, they've changed that. Why can't we do that? So I'm now going to hand the floor to Valerie PECRESSE, Antoine FRÉROT, Ross McINNES, and Edouard PHILIPPE, not necessarily in that order. Valerie is going to talk about how we can reconcile the country with the idea of reform. Antoine's going to talk about finance and politics. Ross is going to talk about the market which needs civil society. And Edward's going to talk to us about a lot of things, including the need to reconcile the French population with the facts and with education, with economic education. They need to understand the principles of economics. So thank you very much Philippe, for your introduction. We have prepared this roundtable, but Philippe hasn't actually given us the questions which we're supposed to answer. Apologies, because I hadn't intended to answer his questions anyway, so I'm just going to give it off the cuff here. And perhaps my approach will be quite gradual. You will remember that wonderful sentence, it's a stupid economy. Stupid economy. And I'm not going to ask the question, but who said that? Was it Bill Clinton? Bill Clinton talking to George Bush for the American presidential election. What was he meaning by that? He was saying that economic reality always comes to hit us in the face, and we have to make sure that the economy is healthy, because there's no great country without a great economy. So that chimes in with the debate of the French presidential election. And we all think, or a lot of us think, or have thought since General de Gaulle, who said that politics is not decided at the stock exchange until all the way through to Mélenchon, who thinks that economics have to bend below social reality. So we've all got a different view about economics. We think today that we have been caught up by economic reality. There's a paradox in this country here in France. We have 2 of the 8 most recent Nobel Prizes for economics. We've got economic thinkers of outstanding levels. But at the same token, we have 168 economists who are signing for the LFA program. So what does that say about France? That says that we are passionate about equality, which is greater than our passion for freedom, and we are passionate about social issues which dominate absolutely everything, which even dominate the reality of the economic world. So I must tell you that whatever the cost, that famous sentence said by Emmanuel Macron, has made the French lose interest in economics. Because if you can have an open bar policy, writing checks left, right and centre, without imagining there's any kind of problem, then why on earth should the population make any effort? Why do we need reforms? Why do we need to work more? Why do we need to reorganize our work, our jobs? That's it's impacting the way we view relationships between each other, that whatever the cost has really sent a scud at reform. The new monetary policy is a hot issue. Stephanie Kelton wrote a book which really did cause an uproar in the economic world, and she was saying that you can print as many notes as you like, banknotes as you like, to re-trigger your economy. However, this question here, that type of monetary policy, which is very expansionist, it is coming face to face with the increase in interest rates, a rise in inflation, and all of these crises. So today, we are suffering from the whatever the cost. So we can't keep writing checks left, right, and centre. Perhaps it would have been better for us during the COVID crisis, rather than doing whatever it costs, to do whatever it takes. So in the government, they were saying whatever it takes. This is what we need to get through the crisis. Whatever it costs is an open bar. So I would have stood for a more targeted policy, which went hand in hand with structural reform. Because, and this is the subject that brings us here today, how do we reconcile the French with this notion of reform? Well, reform must not constantly be synonymous with social damage. It must not be synonymous with blood, sweat, and tears. Reform has to be a win-win situation. The French have to be able to see how their lives will improve thanks to reform. That's the difficult thing. We politicians have very rarely succeeded in explaining how a reform can be translated into an improvement of day-to-day life. So how do we go about making reform not necessarily popular, but at least palatable? How can we get the French on board with this idea of reform? I think that we need reform in France because we need to tell the French the truth. No one's telling them the truth anymore. We have a debt which is sky high. Bruno Le Maire, I think he's going to be here tomorrow morning. I think he's changed his tune a little bit compared to 2 months ago. So we do have a debt which cannot go any further than sky high. We've got huge trade deficit, which is a testimony to the deindustrialization of our country and the waste of our and the fragility of our productive fabric. And then despite what I'm hearing, we have interest rates which are much higher than our neighbours, or that the unemployment rate is twice as high as our neighbours, because we do not have a proper policy to get our youngsters back into work and teach them new trades, for example. That is the truth and nothing but the truth. And I am telling you, I've been saying this for months, and I'm going to continue saying it. I will always say this to the French. I will tell them the truth, even if they don't want to hear it. So we have to tell the French the truth. And to do that, you have to give them a desirable reform. I think there are 4 or 5 vital reforms here for our economy, which we are going to have to do, and we're going to have to be brave enough to do it. We're going to have to reform the state. Public performance is not a swear word. We can no longer remain champions of the world in terms of taxes and have public services that are not at the same level. We may have the best health, transport, all the rest of it, and we were proud of that. But today, what do we have? Protect, educate, and care, the 3 care missions of public services. The soul of our country, protect, educate, and care, is paid for with your taxes. Today, we have very poor performance in all 3 fields. Our justice service is completely flooded and drowning. We have a situation which is really tight, and our hospitals are no longer recruiting. We are not recruiting any healthcare workers. So public performance has to get back to the center of everything we do. And that is how we will get the French on board. Because if we offer them better healthcare, better protection, better education, more opportunities in life, well, then we will win them over. And to do that, we have to reform our state. We've had enough of bureaucracy. We have to reform the state. We have to be brave. We have to decentralize, because we'll be more efficient if we're closer to decisions. And getting back to Philippe's question, it'd be better to knock down some constructions and build again, rather than try and fix them from the inside. I know that from my own experience in my region. Sometimes it's better to close something, shut it down, and start again from zero, because in this digital age, we can create new processes. We reinvent the state. We need to reinvent the state. And then we have to take a look at pensions. Well, there's not a very consensual, no one's looking to get everyone on the same side here. We have to balance out pensions. We have to have a social pact. And we cannot do without, it's essential that we do guarantee people a calm end of life. And that means taking a look at, from the foundations to the rooftop, we have to take a fresh look of how we live, how we produce, how we consume. So the 3rd big reform, and then the 4th big reform, is labor, it's work. We no longer work in the same way. And all over the world, people are throwing in the towel. The COVID crisis has really got people disconnected from their work. We need to get people reconnected to their work, give it meaning, give it remuneration. Of course, and if we reform pensions, I think we should lower pension contributions. Let's make it a win-win situation. We have to have a win-win situation. We have to have higher salaries, better working conditions, new working conditions, and we have to give meaning to work. These are so key for our country. And just to wrap up, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I am convinced that a country that does not manage to reform itself will end up with a revolution on its hands, because an absence of reform increases social tensions. The French people who see that we do not have the necessary leadership to transform our country, well, they are starting to feel afraid. I would quote Hayek, who has really well understood legislation in these crises and the different speculative bubbles. He said, economic achievements are born out of political action and not out of good intentions. So sooner or later, the time of action comes. We mustn't remain Keynesian. We mustn't go on with this whatever the cost. We have to be brave enough to trigger reform.
Antoine.
Antoine, go ahead. Thank you, Philippe. So, if we want to reconcile politics with economics, we need to give a definition of those two concepts. If you want to have a prosperous and solid economy, it's necessary to have a framework for economic policies, a framework that is clear and consistent, embedding economics. And the majority of people should subscribe to it. So it can be the market economics, i.e. capitalism, as part of his framework, administered economy as well, or something else. In France, we chose market economics with a framework, the civil code, the code of commerce, the labor code, and the environmental code, to name but a few. So in terms of economics, politics rules the roost. To reconcile economics with politics means that having an efficient economy with some political achievements. So the economy should be efficient, but there are some constraints. There are some political constraints that have to be dispelled, but that's the opposite. So politics will call the shots because it was a choice that was made by the people. There's a framework we've discussed, and as part of this framework, the economic stakeholders can work in favor of market economics, and administered economy doesn't work. Why? Because people won't be prosperous. They can be other choices as well. But the relationships between economics and politics should be governed by common sense. Politics will call the shots, setting the framework, and politics will give the trajectory, and the economic stakeholders, as part of this framework, will optimize their own actions. And of course, there are some constraints, political constraints. Let us take the environmental framework or the environmental code. So the best way to make sure that all of the stakeholders in economy pollute less means that if you pollute, you will pay more. That's why you have the polluter pays principle, and for most economic stakeholders, when you pollute, when you release CO2, when it is more expensive than not releasing or remove it, the political or the economic stakeholders will remove that framework. And the same goes with the labor code and the code of commerce. If you want to reconcile economics with politics, is to talk about the framework for economic policies desired by people, and the economic stakeholders and players are citizens, and they can be part and parcel of these discussions. But collective choices, political choices, should talk about economy's expectations. What do we expect from a company? Is it only economic performance, or is it a social, societal, environmental performance, or are we just expecting from a company an economic performance, a financial performance? So I think that this is a debate that is being dealt with in the framework law in order to expand the role of economics and the way we can reconcile economics with politics. So if economics rules the roost, I think that the economic political framework will vanish into thin air. It will be disputed and it will be erased. So we need to establish the right priorities, and we need to start from the top, i.e. to have a top-down approach. We need to lay the cornerstones first. But I think that you have a toing and froing movement. When we talk about the manifestos of politicians, most of the time they are helped by sociologists, economists, and they work out a manifesto. So it goes both ways, because you have some long-term ideas. You have green innovation, the importance of higher education for growth. I mean, these ideas were not enshrined in the discussions when the economists put forward these ideas and when the politicians decided to take up those ideas. So Ross, of course, I mean, when you discuss ideas, I mean, we need to take on board all the ideas. But in terms of decisions, I mean, the politicians, I mean, will translate these ideas into policies. Of course, we've said that politicians, I mean, can't make a good job, but it doesn't mean that the economists should take up those ideas or should take up those policies. Ross? So, market, state, and civil society. This threefold approach. What is your take on that? Thank you, Philippe. I'm a lonely liberal person. So if you have a look at what happened over the past 2 years, these are the 3 C's. And my perception has changed. COVID, climate, conflict, the 3 C's, as it were. First, COVID. First C, the state worked efficiently. And the state guaranteed the economy some jobs, some skills were preserved and protected, and social cohesion was beefed up, and our employees were protected. Climate. Antoine talked about that. With climate change, there will be some choices. Choices will have to be made, and only politicians can impose these choices with CO2 rates, and some saving measures should be implemented in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And the role of politicians is key. And then there's a matter of regulation. Third C, conflicts. So we've witnessed tragic events of the past 6 months. So all states are sovereign, but we revisited our supply policies. We are talking about friendly shoring, near shoring. So with these 3 examples, the economics and politics should interact. Remember what Gordon Brown said about Adam Smith. You have the invisible invisible hand, and the invisible hand needs some help. So the politicians, they need the state, but the state should be reformed. And I will provide you with 3 examples. The state was the ultimate guarantor of the economy, but when there's a leak of water in my home, the insuring company or the insurance company will redeem the costs, but they won't choose the paint. But what is important is to focus on the right innovations, because the state is not imbued with a risk culture. So in France, it is legitimate to waste public money, but it is unacceptable to waste public money for cultural reasons that are well understood. So everybody has a role to play. And we talked about energy transition. And I think that every year 3 points of GDP will be used. Households, companies, businesses, and state will have to do their part. Some people will have to make some sacrifices, and the state will have to protect households. Investors will have to invest in profitability. And of course, they will have to invest in capacities. And then the state has a role to play, because the state will have to relax a tax pressure to enable households and companies to make these efforts without undermining their margins and without undermining the necessary efforts in investments. So the public treasure shouldn't be the vampire. So I will use two formula. Edgar IV was quite cynical, so we decided to instruct changes, but there's a sense of status quo, and I don't know how to stop the status quo. So I will be quite sanguine, and I will use and quote Jean Monnet. So men will accept changes when it's a need, but there's a need when the crisis is rife, and that's true. We are in a crisis situation. So now I will hand over to Edouard Philippe, and Edouard Philippe will be touching upon different topics. Of course, decision makers have a role to play, and citizens, they are cross with facts, and maybe we are not knowledgeable about economics. Economics is different to maths, and 2 + 2 does not equal to 4 for many people. So how can we be reconciled with the principle of the economy, with the economic principles? So floor is yours. Thank you. So to reconcile politics with economics, there are different layers. So it's very difficult to come up with an all-encompassing answer, and I do share what has been said by the different speakers. So what does it mean to reconcile economics with politics? And I decided to come up with the most basic definition. How can we make sure that facts, economic realities, science mechanisms are taken into account as part of public action? And it's another way of talking about politics. So what is the role of public action? So when you raise that question, you think about politicians, whatever their beliefs, they want to make progress. They would like things to move ahead, and they are using their beliefs and convictions in order to do some good to the country. All of them, all politicians, all political leaders. So the task should be easy, but at the end of the day, it's not easy at all. It's complex. Why is it complicated? Why should we reconcile economics with politics? I mean, those two terms are not antinomic. We shouldn't ask the question reconciling gravitational law and politics. When you take an apple in your hand, it will fall. And we can explain why the apple falls. So the politics won't explain to you that the apple won't fall. But in economics it's different. Why? Because my hunch is that all together, and I'm not targeting specific politicians, and I'm considering everybody. I think that we can tell stories and we don't look at facts. And that's fascinating. From time to time, we are misled by our own views, and we need to look at facts. Political debates are overexposed with lots of different positions and postures. If you have a look at the media, journalists, most of the time, they focus on editorials, but they don't analyze facts in the relevant fashion and in the public debate. So people are telling things that are totally disconnected with gross facts. So basically, we are misleading ourselves. So it can do some good. It can be part and parcel of a narrative that will revitalize, that will energize people. But at the end of the day, when you don't look at facts, I mean, facts will look at you. And the facts are tough from time to time. So most of the time, we focus on rationales that are out of touch. Basically, you have some side positions that are not in line with reality, and that's not compatible with this idea of reconciling economics with politics. That's why it is really difficult to reconcile politics with economics. Second reason, in my country, in our country, I'm not saying that I'm different and that I'm an expert in everything. That's not the case. In our country, there's an economic culture that is quite restrictive. I will give you an example. So if you consider prices and the way they are established, there are lots of smart people who've written about a price, how a price is being established, designed. But you have price variations. It's a matter of making sure that supply meets demand. And in 30 seconds, I mean, have given you all my knowledge in economic science. This is something that I've understood. Because as part of the French public debate, and whether you come from the left or from the right, there are some people who will tell you that freezing a price won't have any consequences, or there might be some impact. Basically, the price is frozen, so it won't change. But that's not the case. When you freeze a price, of course, I mean, the prices won't change, but there will be a lasting imbalance. And if it's a sensitive topic, there will be a mismatch between supply and demand, and other policies will have to be implemented. So most of the time, you need to do things differently, but it's not always rewarding. So at the end of the day, there are some significant mechanisms that are out of touch, or there are some mechanisms that are not implemented. So we prefer to mislead ourselves instead of looking at the facts. I think that there are two people, I mean, who agree with me on the issue of prices. So the fight is starting. Moreover, you have to consider other interactions. You have economic stakeholders who are engaged, who are committed, and you have politicians, you have the academic world. But I can tell you that all those bodies interact. But of course, we don't see eye to eye on many issues, and there is not a positive trend. So allow me to give you an example. So we talked about pensions, and rightly so. I'm not only interested in pensions, but let us focus on rational insights regarding pensions. So we invented an instrument called the core, the high-level civil servants with an economic background. So it's a matter of being rational in a debate. Most of the time, you have a debate based on postures, based on personal interests. So what have I noticed when I decided to focus on pensions? Basically, we don't want to look at the facts, and we like to mislead ourselves. So we've made some assumptions, large-scale assumptions, unrealistic assumptions, in order to take on board everybody. And we thought that we would get a consensus, and there are some people, according to the different assumptions, we don't need to change the pension system. So if there's a 3% productivity in the next 10 years, we won't have to change our pension system. But we haven't recorded a 3% rise in productivity. So that's why we need to reform the pension system. So this kind of science is not where we would like it to be in order to set the cornerstones. So I'm delighted to be with you. I'm next to a prominent economist, so I've been thinking about pensions. In 2017, the President of the Republic was elected. He wanted to embark upon a pensions reform. It was too complex, too complicated, but a very smart pension system. And this pension reform was prepared by economists. It was a smart pension reform that he had in mind. Allow me to finish. So I'm just trying to do my own therapy. So it was a very intelligent, smart pension reform. It was complex as well, and there were some people who said, be careful, it might be an intelligent, a smart pension reform. It was a fair pension reform, and it was supposed to be an efficient pension reform. But people said that the reform had to be simpler. It's important to focus on contributions. We are not going to create a single pension system instead of having 30 pension systems. You can have 3 pension systems. And in fact, I mean, you can remove things that are no longer justified. Of course, there's a political debate, and people will say that's not the right strategy, but that's quite understandable or normal. But in the public debate, the economists do not take on board the constraints. And if I can remember well, the economists didn't talk about the constraints having to do with the pension reform.
Yes, pension reform. I didn't come up with that idea. It came spontaneously. Don't worry about it, Philippe. Don't worry. But I quickly realized that we had to go off in a different direction, indeed. So academics academics can admit that they were wrong. I was wondering if there's not a problem in France in relation to other countries. For example, I've known central bank managers, and they're great. In England and the United States, the managers of those banks are often academics who had studied. We had one, it was Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was Minister for Finance. But in the United States and the UK, a lot of academics go from university into the banks, whereas in our case, they have wonderful training. They go to Sciences Po, the INA also. You do a bit of economics in Sciences Po school and INA. When I went to the INA school in Strasbourg, I had just one class in economics. So I wondered if that's not a bit of a problem. Do we not have a problem training our high-level civil servants, whereas in the English-speaking world, they go into academia, they do research, and does that not transpire in the differences that we have between those two countries? I've always wondered about that. If that's just not unique to France. Well, Philippe, there's more than economics to life. Politics is much broader than that. There aren't enough economics classes, but there aren't enough anthropology classes at Sciences Po. There aren't enough lessons in quantic sciences, etc. But economics are a tool for society. I'm not surprised that political leaders, because the governor of the central bank is a political role. You're not a player there, but you have responsibility there. You have to guide the economy with the different levels of rates and stuff. So for this particular role, you need to have around you plenty of scientists, as the Prime Minister has said. You need to have around you plenty of other people with knowledge in social economy, etc. But these are political decisions we're talking about. These decisions are guided by democratic choices. So you think that Bernard Bloquet, who is a researcher in economics, or Mervyn King, the same, do you think that that was a bit of a problem? Or because we had these great ministers of finance and central bank managers, it's a question that I'm wondering. Well, I think here we're talking about something which is very important. These are these footbridges between the world of academia and the world of economics. In the United States, the big universities aren't scared to create their own startups and work for the economy. In France, we're in silos the whole time. Even our researchers are in silos. They will only have a career in academia, for example. I think one of the keys will be to bring down those dividing walls. I think the state must make it easier to recruit people who come from the business world, and that we have hybrid cultures, but we need to do that in universities as well. We're talking about reform. Well, Edouard Philippe said something which I experienced when I was reforming universities. We're very Cartesian here in France. We want cathedral-scale reforms, but they're built with matchsticks. If you take one matchstick away, if you take it away, everything will tumble down, and then your whole construction is worthless. So I think that reform must be elastic. It's like a rubber band. So when you're climbing up the mountain, you can put your tack into the mountainside. You have to tie your elastic band in there. If your elastic band breaks, then you tumble to the ground, and then you start building again. So you have to get that elastic as high up the mountain as you can, and then you plant your nail in the mountain. Once we've been able to move up the mountain, then there's a no return policy, and you can't go back any further. You just have to build higher. But you know your foundations are safe. You don't need to make small steps, but you have to make sure everything is safe. Economics are very useful for assessing things. But their theory, no, we're not talking about theory, we're talking about empirical assessment. In theory, something might be wonderful, but then each individual, and you mentioned Vipers Delpla, who says that you have to buy back income when you're getting rid of it. I think we have to compensate the losers. It costs a lot at the beginning, but at the end of the day, it's a good investment. Ross, did you want to say a word? We've just got 2 or 3 minutes left. About Professor with his head in the clouds being at the top of a central bank, I think Milton Friedman was very lucid about himself, and I'm going to quote him in English, says the speaker. He who can does, he who cannot do, he teaches, and he who can't teach, teaches economics. And I'm sure this is my last time at this meeting here in Aix. But there are some questions in the room, some wonderful ones. Could you explain the sense of the word reinvent, and how should we go about reinventing the state? Who would like to rise to that one? Well, I was the one who used that expression, so I think that we have to start much lower down. Let's stop adding layer on top of layer. I think decentralization is key. When a mayor wants to do something in the town, they get it done. And we have to count on them. We have to hyper-decentralize when we're talking about housing, urban ecology, combating climate change. There are so many things we can do really, really locally. There aren't the right words for this in French, but in English we use the word empower. These are words which don't exist in French. We're placing our trust in someone and relying on them to get something done. There are public-private partnerships, oh, excuse me for swearing, but we can reinvent the state by using something which the youngsters like, these startups. Let me give an example. We have a lot of job seekers in France, And the region that I preside over started up lots of training courses. There are millions of training courses which have been opened throughout the country by the different regions. It's not the job seeker center who sends me all of the unemployed people. It was a website, the equivalent of Gumtree on an internet, where I get the most requests from. So where do people go? They go to this equivalent site of Gumtree. And that's where they go to look for a job. It's digital, and it means that efficacy is enhanced. That means it's none of the taxpayers' money being used. I think reinventing means doing things completely different. So how can we use civil servants for this? I think we have to ask the civil servants how they would go about doing what they know how to do in a completely different manner. And I think they're much more creative than we give them credit for. Well, that's it. Our time is up. People are hungry. It's lunchtime. Thank you very much, everybody.